England in 1580 was a very different country to the one we know today, with language, customs and clothing alien to our own. The lives of women in this period are often badly documented beyond knowing their husband, father and sometimes children. For many, we have just birth and death dates, and there are several where even their name doesn't survive, just their husbands. How then to understand what life was like for Anne Martyn, youngest daughter of Nicholas and Margaret of Athelhampton? Based on the scant evidence we have about her life and what we know of other women like her, we can but conjecture. In 1580, Anne Martyn was probably in her teens. She would have been expected to rise early, typically around 6 o'clock in the morning. Servants rose even earlier, though, to begin the day's work. While some higher-ranking servants had truckle beds that could slide under a four-poster bed, most just had roll mats or mattresses. These could be rolled up and put out of the way during the day. Four-poster beds were valuable and would often be shared by siblings or even entire families. Anne's older sister Jane was also unmarried in 1580, and so they may well have shared a bed at this time. Once awake, Anne would have said her prayers. In this Catholic household, the Angelus prayer would have been said 3 times a day. The prayer book Anne uses here was written by Cardinal Pole, once vicar of Puddletown. After praying, it would have been time to get dressed. There were lots of layers of clothing. Those next to the skin, including the smock and partlet, were made of washable linen. Worn over the smock so that it wouldn't need as much laundering, the partlet could be heavily embroidered. The Spanish farthingale was a cone-shaped hoop skirt, stiffened with either baleen from Wales or bents, dried grass bound into hoops. Next was the kirtle, a dress with a stiffened bodice to provide support, and a decorated front called a forepart. Kirtles could lace up at the front, side or back. Backlacing required a servant's help when dressing. The stomacher, a decorative piece matching the forepart, was pinned across the front of the bodice. The outermost layer was the gown. There were lots of different styles. This one is an English gown. It fastened at the waist and was open to show the stomacher and forepart. Decorative layers showed off wealth. Over the linen kercher, a silk velvet hat could be worn. A silk or jewelled girdle was often tied around the waist. Starched ruffs were pinned in place at the neck and wrists. These became bigger as the 16th century went on. Another visible show of wealth, jewellery was worn by men and women alike. Positions in the 16th century were very strict, with those of lower status having to bow or curtsy to those of higher status. Once dressed, Anne would have been expected to go and pay her respects to her parents. As a gentlewoman, Anne would have been expected to learn how to run a household from a young age. This would have included dealing with the accounts, food, and undertaking bits of sewing, all to keep the household running. The kitchen, dairy, bakehouse, brewhouse and stillroom all had to be managed. But gentlewomen would also take part in the practical side of things, with even women at the court making their own fruit preserves, for example. Another way to learn all of this was to be sent away to another household to serve as a page or an attendant. Like an apprenticeship, this was a way for a child to learn from the bottom up how to be a gentleman or gentlewoman. Needlework was an important part of a gentlewoman's education, with even queens and their ladies making shirts and smocks. Shirts, smocks and other linens were made in the home by women. Male tailors made most of the outerwear. Without radio or television, women sewing could gossip, sing, or listen to a book being read aloud. Gentlefolk often visited each other's houses, with visits lasting from a few days to several weeks or more, depending on things like distance. A gentleman travelling would take servants who might provide protection on the road as well as looking after his horse. this particular visitor is Anthony Floyer from Floyer's Hayes in Devon, a young man who we know later married Anne. While it was common for royal children to be married at a young age, gentlewomen very rarely married before their late teens. Marriage was still about business though, and who they would marry was based on land, money and connections. Even though marriage wasn't for love, the couple were meant to get along and they were encouraged to spend time together. Anne married Anthony Floyer in 1593. Dancing was an important skill for any gentleborn person, and lessons could be had from formal dance tutors or family members. Slower dances like pavans and almains were good for conversation and getting to know your partner. Faster dances like galliards or la volta were a good way to show off your skill and athletic ability. Music could be provided by hired professional musicians or by other family members with varying degrees of skill. Dinner was the main meal of the day and began between about 10 a.m. and noon, depending on the household. First, the table was laid, with napkins and plates for each diner. They were expected to bring their own cutlery. Whether the household was Protestant or Catholic, a grace would then be said or sung, giving thanks for the food. The food was then processed into the hall, with each dish shown to the diners so that they knew what was on the menu. There were many different dishes, with meat, spices and sugar being used to show off the family's wealth. Spices were used for their flavour rather than to disguise the taste of rotting meat, despite popular belief. Affording spices meant you could afford fresh or properly preserved meat, and the dangers of eating gone-off meat were well known. In the screens passage, the dishes were then carved up and divided onto mess plates to be served to the diners in the Great Hall. White bread took more work to make than brown bread, and so was another way to display your wealth. Drinks served at dinner could include home-brewed ale, imported wine, or, thanks to the nearby River Piddle, fresh water. Writers like Andrew Boord discussed how certain types of water were better for drinking than others, according to their source, with distilled and boiled water considered best. Cheap common loaf was used to clean the plate between each remove, rather than being eaten. The top of the crust was served to the most important person, which is where we get the phrase upper crust from. The food on each mess plate was known as a remove, and there were several different removes in each meal. Removes were divided between diners, with strict rules about how to share. Diners ate with a knife, spoon and fingers, which were kept clean using a napkin. Some people used brickers, which are a bit like a fork. Uneaten food could be cleaned onto a voiding dish between removes, and the plate mopped clean with common loaf. At the end of a meal, a banquet or sweet remove might be served, made entirely of sugary sweetmeats, another way to show wealth. A walk in the gardens might have been a good way for Anne and Anthony to get to know one another better. They wouldn't have been unaccompanied though, they'd have been escorted by a page or two. Sixteenth century gardens were productive as well as decorative, with lots of fruit trees, herbs and edible flowers. During the harvest, a lot of work went into carefully storing and preserving food to last through the winter. Apples could be stored with dried elderflowers or rose petals to impart scent and flavour. By 1580, archery practice was no longer required by law, but it was still a popular sport for both men and women, as well as children. The English longbow was made of imported alpine yew, which is slower growing than its English counterpart. Arrows were generally fletched with goose feathers. This could be done either by a professional or by the archer themselves. Just like with dinner, at supper a Latin grace was said to give thanks before food was eaten. Supper consisted of fewer, simpler dishes than dinner, though it was still an opportunity to show off the family's wealth and good taste. Generally, it was less formal than dinner and might have been eaten in the parlour rather than in the draughty great hall. The final Angelus of the day, a Catholic prayer commemorating the incarnation of Christ, was sung after supper. This might be followed by more music as an evening entertainment, with part books containing songs both religious and secular. Lutes and viols might be played as accompaniment. Lessons on these instruments were seen as a key part of upper-class education. Music might continue through the evening, though other entertainments could include reading, gambling and conversation. Before going to bed, Anne would have made reverence to her mother, just like she did in the morning. She might then have read a bedtime story to her niece and nephew, Mary and Henry Brune. Their father, Henry Brune, was married to Anne's older sister Elizabeth, and is described as living at Athelhampton in this period. Anne would have undressed with the help of an attendant, her clothes either being laid out for the next day or neatly placed in a chest. Instead of having particular clothes just to sleep in, Anne would have gone to bed dressed in her linen smock and kercher. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and hit the subscribe button to see more videos about Athelhampton and the people who used to live here. If you'd like to learn more about Anne or her family, you can always purchase the Anne of Athelhampton book series, a fictional account of some of the adventures she might have got up to, or even visit Athelhampton itself. If you come during October half-term each year, you'll have the chance to travel back to Elizabethan times and meet Anne's family, as the house is brought to life by living historians.